This episode was originally made for my patrons on Patreon, part of a monthly series on history looked at through the lens of the history guy's hats. And now we're repackaging some of those episodes for the YouTube audience. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider becoming a patron. You know, the idea of a soldier protecting their head with a steel helmet makes a lot of sense, because without their head, your soldier's not very useful. But the advent of gunpowder actually largely rendered steel helmets obsolete. They couldn't stop a bullet, and at that point, they were an awful lot of weight that couldn't protect that soldier. A lot of people are surprised to find out that, say, at the advent of the First World War, not one of the major belligerents was regularly issuing steel helmets to its soldiers. But while a helmet still could not stop a bullet, the shrapnel munitions of that war demonstrated that there was still a need for head protection. And the story of the first modern steel helmet is history that deserves to be remembered. This is a steel combat helmet of the type that's popularly called an Adrian helmet, and it's most associated with the French, but it was used by several armies. This particular example is the Model 26 Adrian helmet, which means this is the type of helmet that was worn during the Second World War, and it's primarily associated with the French, but it was also used by the Poles, the Belgians, even the Japanese. Lots of armies use the Adrian helmet design, but this particular one is French. I know that because of the badge on the front, which shows a grenade, which means that this is a French infantry helmet. And the story of the Adrian helmet is really quite interesting, although it goes back to the model before the M26, the M15 Adrian helmet, which was used in the First World War. The origins of the Great War were complex, as European politics and balances of power had left the continent on the brink of war for years. The trigger was the Balkans, where the empires of Austro-Hungary and Russia, as well as local nationalists, were vying for influence in the face of a declining Ottoman Empire. The region was called at the time the powder keg of Europe. When tensions exploded into war between Austro-Hungary and Serbia, the great powers got drawn in. First, Russia mobilized to defend Serbia, which then drew in Germany, which then drew in France, and then Britain. By August of 1914, Europe was in a general war that none of the major powers had wanted, and for which they were not completely prepared. For example, despite various experiences with modern weapons, equipment was largely a throwback to a bygone era. As mentioned before, none of the major powers were issuing steel helmets to their troops at the start of the war. German troops marched off to war wearing pickelobs, hats made of boiled leather with a spike on top. If this helmet, very like the one my great-uncle wore into combat, looks like a helmet, it's actually purely decorative. It's made out of leather. It wouldn't give you any protection from, say, shell fragments. The French army at the beginning of the war was almost comically equipped for a different era. Their pants were bright red, making them more obvious on the battlefield. On their head they wore kepis, essentially the same hats that American troops had worn during the Civil War a half-century before. The German armies were highly successful in the opening campaign of the First World War in August of 1914, in something called the Battle of the Frontiers. They so pushed back the Allied forces that it looked for a while like Paris might fall and that the British Expeditionary Force would have to abandon the continent. Although the war had not settled down into the bloody trench war that defined the Great War, it was still obscenely deadly. On one single day, August 22nd of 1914, near the Belgian-French border, 27,000 French troops had been killed in a single day. It was, to that point in history, the deadliest day for any army ever in history. But a massive counterattack along the Marne River in September held the German attack. The Marne was considered a victory for the Allies, preventing the fall of Paris and keeping France in the war. But the German army held a significant portion of northern France and Belgium. After the Marne, the Western Front shifted into the horrible static trench war that would characterize the Great War. In 1914, virtually all of the nations involved thought it was going to be a short war. The common phrase was, "We'll be home by Christmas." Instead, 1914 set the stage for one of the longest and deadliest wars in human history. To get an idea, in 1914 alone, and remember the war didn't start until August, more than 1 million soldiers were killed on the European battlefields of the First World War. One of the most famous parts of the First Battle of the Marne were the so-called taxicabs of the Marne. The legend is that a fleet of Paris taxicabs rushed reinforcements to the front, saving Paris from the German assault. The importance of the taxis has been wildly overstated. Estimates are that they only moved around 5,000 troops in a battle that included more than 1 million soldiers. Far more reinforcements were actually moved by train, but the taxicabs of the Marne did demonstrate the utility of motor vehicles in the age of modern warfare and created an enduring legend. One of the men behind the idea of employing the taxicabs was an innovative officer of the Quartermaster Corps, Louis Auguste Adrian. Louis Adrian was not some brilliant tactician. He didn't command troops in the field. He was a supply officer and a military engineer, and he was a good one, but he also had a weak constitution. After a career in the French army, in the colonies, and then fighting fraud and corruption within the French military acquisitions system, he had retired early due to ill health in 1913. When the Great War started in 1914, he asked to be brought back into active service and was assigned the Assistant Director of Stewardship for the Ministry of War, which essentially put him in charge of uniforms and equipment for the French army, both of which were in desperately short supply. He made many contributions, from a redesigned pack that better distributed weight, to more sturdy boots, to sheepskin-lined capes for winter, to a new design for a safer and more healthy army barracks that was called the Adrian Barracks. But for all his many innovations, Louis Adrian was most known for his response to a shocking trend that had to do with the new weapons of the industrial age, the greatly improved artillery and shrapnel munitions. For the common French soldier in the Great War, 77% of the battlefield injuries were actually head injuries from bomb blasts and shrapnel, and of those, 80% were fatal. Louis Adrian was the man to address the problem. His first solution was the cloth métallique, or metal cap. It was a small skull cap that was intended to wear underneath the képi. It was controversial. The chief quartermaster did not want to spend the money, thinking the war would be over soon. It was uncomfortable, so much so that troops often took to wearing it on top of their képi rather than under it. It was derisively called the soup bowl, a function for which it was almost certainly put to use. And it protected from about 60% of shrapnel injuries. Approved in February of 1915, 700,000 were made and distributed by the end of winter. Despite its limitations, the metal cap unquestionably saved lives. Joseph Joffre, the commander-in-chief of French forces, tasked Adrian with coming up with a superior design. Adrian set about seeking a design that would provide more protection, but be more comfortable for the soldier. His final design, the M15 Adrian helmet, was of relatively thin metal, only 0.7 millimeters thick. It was of simple design, consisting of a stamped oversized skull cap, a two-piece metal brim, and a comb, which was intended to offer added protection from directly above. The helmet was easy to produce and relatively lightweight, less than 2 pounds. They were so easy to produce that they only cost 3.35 francs each, less than the 3.8 francs cost of the regulation cloth cap. When the design finished in the spring of 1915, and the first production orders going out in July, the French army had equipped all of their frontline troops with the steel helmet by winter. While it still generated some complaints, by any measure it was a success. By 1916, head wounds had dropped to 22%, and only half were fatal. By the end of 1916, 7 million Adrian helmets had been distributed. By the end of the war, 20 million were made. The design was adopted by the armies of Belgium, Brazil, China, Greece, Italy, Japan, Luxembourg, Mexico, Morocco, Peru, Poland, Romania, Russia, Serbia, Spain, Siam, the USSR, and Yugoslavia. The helmet was also used by the United States, starting with the volunteers with the American Ambulance Field Service. While the American Army was more known for wearing the M1917 helmet based on the British Brodie helmet, with which British troops started being issued starting in September of 1915, one famous American unit wore the Adrian helm. 4 American regiments, made up almost entirely of African Americans and Puerto Ricans, were assigned directly to the French army. America was still largely a segregated nation, and many white soldiers did not want to fight alongside black troops. But they were more accepted by the French, who were used to colonial troops and desperately in need of men. Their service was exceptional. The unit called themselves the Black Rattlers. The French called them the Men of Bronze. But today they are most well known by the name of respect given to them by their enemy, the Germans, the Hellfighters. Wearing American uniforms and French Adrian helmets, the famed Harlem Hellfighters spent 191 days in the front-line trenches, more than any other American unit. After the First World War, the Adrian helmet was somewhat redesigned. The M26 model, like you see here, was simplified. It's stamped from a single piece rather than having 2 pieces for the brim. It is made of a stronger steel. It only has the badge on the front. Rather than the large badge, it's got this little medallion because this requires a smaller hole, as the 2 rivet holes for the large medallion that was the emblem on the World War I helmet were found to weaken the strength of the helmet. The M26 Adrian helmet was used throughout the Second World War by many armies and even beyond. The Adrian helmet has been called the first modern steel helmet. and its designer, General Louis Adrian, who did not command troops on the battlefield during the Great War, has sometimes been called the man who saved 1,000,000 lives. After the war, Louis Adrian was made a Grand Officer in the Legion of Honor. He passed away in 1933. A number of viewers have asked me how I got interested in history, and a lot of it has to do with things like this Adrian helm. I don't know what soldier owned this helmet. I got it on eBay. I don't know if this dent in the side came during the war or if it's something that came after. But what I do know is that this helmet represents a period of enormous sacrifice and unbelievable heroism. That it's a piece of life-saving technology developed for the killing fields. That it's a piece of history and a reminder of history that deserves to be remembered. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.